If you have an obsidian mirror or any other polished obsidian stone, then chances are at some point you've wondered to yourself, is it possible to engrave obsidian? The answer is yes, but there is more to it than just taking a sharp tool or a sharp rock and scratching your design into the surface. Obsidian is glass, which means that if you scratch the surface of it, you're only going to end up with a bunch of micro-fractures emanating from the point of contact. This will look cool in certain lighting, but it won't really be an actual engraved design like you might expect. There are two main ways to actually engrave obsidian. The first method is by using a high-speed rotating tool such as a Dremel with a diamond tip attached to it. If you hold this against the mirror, then rotate it very fast, you can actually burn the surface of the obsidian with friction. This will cause it to thermally shock the material and make it fracture. Now, because this is essentially burning the material, it works best on darker obsidian. With lighter colored obsidian, you will notice that the edges of your engraving will be black due to the burning of the obsidian, which may or may not be desirable depending on your project. The second way to engrave obsidian is through mechanical polishing with abrasive compounds. This is how glass is engraved for the most part. You use a grit that is fine enough to cut the glass, but not so fine that it leaves behind a cloudy film on the surface. The problem is that obsidian has a hardness of 5 to 5.5 on the Mohs scale, whereas glass is about 3 to 4. So you need to find a grit that will polish the obsidian without damaging the surface. It needs to be harder than obsidian, but softer than the other materials that your mirror is in contact with. For instance, my mirror is set into a copper backing, so I can't use a grit that's harder than copper. I found that the ideal grit for my mirror was 220 grit aluminum oxide. It's a fairly coarse grit, but it works well for the obsidian while not damaging the copper backing. If you don't have access to a lap or another flat surface for polishing, then you can do it by hand. It'll just take a little bit longer, and you'll probably get a little crappier finish. The easiest way to do it by hand is to throw your grit onto a piece of felt or cloth, and then rub your mirror across it. Make sure you spray your mirror with some type of lubricant, like WD-40 or mineral oil before you start. Otherwise, the polishing grit will bind to the obsidian and you'll just end up making a mess. As you rub your mirror, you'll feel resistance as the polishing grit digs into the surface. Once the polishing grit starts getting smeared into the material, your engraving will be complete. Keep in mind that the deeper you want to engrave, the longer you'll have to polish and the more time you'll spend creating your design. A good rule of thumb is that it takes about 5 minutes per 1/16 of an inch of depth. For instance, if you wanted to polish a design that's 1/8 of an inch deep, it would take approximately 40 minutes. If you wanted to go deeper than that, then you would need to use a lower grit and work your way up. Unfortunately, the material removal rate of obsidian is extremely slow compared to other materials. So a design that's 1/4 of an inch deep could easily take several hours to accomplish. You may also notice that the edges of your engravings are blurry no matter how hard you try, and that's because of the thermal shock that occurs when the material fractures. To help combat this, you can remove the obsidian from its backing before you begin engraving. That way you won't have anything constraining the material, and the thermal shock can cause it to crack further away from the design. But even if you do this, the thermal shock from the engraving process will still occur, and it will still result in some degree of blurriness around your design. Since the engraving process is so slow and tedious, I decided to simplify my design as much as possible. I started off by drawing my idea onto a sheet of paper and then taped it to the mirror as a guide. Then I took a pencil and traced along the lines of my design, which left small indentations in the obsidian. This gave me a guide to follow while I was polishing the design by hand. If you decide to do something similar, then it's highly recommended that you draw your design on the back of the mirror. That way you can trace your lines without having to worry about smearing the front. Since my design was drawn on the front of the mirror, I had to tape plastic wrap over it to prevent smearing. To begin, I sprayed my mirror with some mineral oil and then laid it down on top of my makeshift lap. I held the edge of the mirror so that it was on moving around while I was working and used my free hand to rub the polishing pad across the mirror. As you can see in the video, the polishing is extremely slow and tedious. It takes several minutes just to make a tiny mark on the obsidian, but as you keep rubbing, you'll notice that the polishing grit starts getting smeared into the obsidian and the line starts to become more defined. Once I finished the initial cut, I removed the plastic wrap from the mirror and inspected my progress. To my surprise, the design was looking pretty good. I let the mirror dry for a few minutes and then applied some more lubricant. Then I switched to a finer grit of aluminum oxide. The goal here is to smooth out the engraving and remove any imperfections that occurred during the initial cut. After several more minutes of polishing, I wiped off the excess lubricant and let the mirror dry again. I was happy with how the engraving turned out. The lines were crisp and there was minimal fuzziness around the perimeter. The entire process took about an hour and a half, but I think the end result was worth it. Now, you'll be probably wondering how I came up with the idea of engraving an obsidian mirror in the first place. Well, last year I made a video on how to make a DIY kaleidoscope using an old CD case and a piece of obsidian. One of the viewers suggested I make one that had a custom engraved design on it. After doing some research, I found that a company was selling engraved obsidian mirrors, but they were really expensive. So I thought to myself, why not make one for less money? And that's when I got this cheap mirror from the Dollar Tree and decided to experiment. Unfortunately, my first attempt was a failure, because I didn't realize that you needed to remove the protective film from the mirror before engraving. But after that mistake was fixed, the engraving turned out great. I was able to achieve crisp lines, and the overall finish of the mirror was unaffected by the engraving process. The only thing that was really tedious was the amount of time it took to engrave, but considering that I was doing it by hand, I was actually pretty impressed with the results. After finishing my design, I put the mirror back into its copper backing and soldered the joints. Then I drilled a hole near the top of the frame and hung it on the wall. As far as future projects with obsidian, I think it would be neat to engrave a design into a larger piece of obsidian. Maybe I'll make a sun catcher or a window decal. I'm also thinking of trying my hand at glass blowing. I bought a cheap glass blowing kit on Amazon, and I hope to try it out soon. Hopefully, I don't end up making a mess. If you liked this video, then check out one of my other videos on how to make a kaleidoscope using an old CD case. Thanks for watching.